Okay, sorry, I was just waiting for the recording to get going. So I came to the WallCAP as a community archaeologist in September last year. What a time to join, just after moving back to the Northeast. And although I've excavated many Romano-British sites, including an amphitheatre and temples, pottery production sites, burials, field systems and farmsteads, you'll have to excuse my enormous excitement at being back at the greatest Romano-British site of them all, and where I did my first ever excavating as a teenager at Segedunum and the Lanes in Carlisle. It was walking along the wall as a child and trying to imagine its height and its bulk and the busyness of the forts, their smells and sounds and the loneliness of the turrets. That was one of the main reasons that I became an archaeologist. But that World Heritage Site itself is very much far from being the only reason, even the main reason, that I'm thrilled to be part of this project. All my career, I've worked with community-rooted archaeology projects from Orkney to Oxfordshire. So here, Kerry, I'm bringing the people and the archaeology together. To me, that's what it's all about. It's people and archaeology. All archaeological work, I think, belongs to the local people, and it's part of the warp and weft of community and understanding your own physical environment and its history. And all the very best projects have got community and sharing at the heart of their design and work to contribute to everybody's lifelong learning and enjoyment and fun. And it's absolutely the case also that you can hit the highest standards out in the field, in research, in publication, and in telling and sharing the stories of archaeology with community projects. So I haven't had the opportunity to meet very many of you in person yet, although I must say the digital training sessions we've been doing have been really enjoyable. We've been doing, amongst other things, seminar type discussions, which have been great fun and really inspiring. So I'm very much looking forward to more of the digital discussion, but above all, to meeting as many as possible of you face to face and getting out there in the field together. And perhaps one other thing worth saying is that the work we do isn't just about digging. There are all sorts of things that you can do on site that are not about getting down on your knees with a fiddly little trowel. Right, final preliminary. I know we've got a more diverse audience today. So if I explain things that some of you are very, very familiar with, it's one of the reasons, but also I'm getting into this, back into a real familiarity with this landscape and the archaeology. So bear with my enthusiasm. As Kerry said, the Heritage at Risk strand in the WallCAP project is about working to better understand sites in the World Heritage site that are at risk and are on Heritage England's Heritage at Risk list. So understanding them better might include survey of various sorts, might include some very targeted excavation, and also repair and consolidation work that hopefully are going to remove some of the sites from the register, reducing their risk and leaving them in a better position for everybody's future enjoyment and for their future management. And all of this, of course, was intended to be done with the active, full participation of the WallCAP volunteers, including all the excavation. And in the event, everything I've done so far, it hasn't been possible to involve volunteers because of the pandemic. And that's been a great sadness, but we needed to press on with some of the work while we have the funding and the project is active. And we've been trying our best with our videos and updates from the work when we were out there in the field to give you a sense of what we were doing. But today I'm going to look at the excavation and the repair work that we did manage to do last autumn. And the excavation I'll be talking about is at this site here. And I think this must be one of the most wonderful locations, dramatic locations to have an excavation. Okay, so I'm first going to talk about the repair and wall top consolidation work that's been done. And the first lot is in the famous central section of the wall along the Windseal Ridge at Peel Gap and Cat Stairs. And in this photograph, we're looking west towards Milecastle 40 on Walltown Crags. And you've got the steel rig car park here. And you've got the stretch of wall coming down here where it meets the field gate, and on this side it's an ordinary, if there is any such thing as an ordinary, dry stone wall. And it's an incredibly well visited stretch of the wall, and there are ongoing difficulties with people climbing up on stretches of the wall to walk on it or to get that fabulous photograph of the wonderful views there are here. And in some cases that has gone beyond wearing the wall top down to dislodging stones, and in fact to precipitating collapses. So this is the area that we are working in, shown in two maps, and you can see that we've got Milecastle 39 here and Turret 39A on Peel Crag, between one of the collapses that we worked on here at Cat Stairs and the Milecastle. And Turret 39A was excavated in 1911, but had been demolished in the late 2nd century, and the recess it left in the curtain wall filled in. And the other thing I think that it's worth remembering about this particular stretch of the wall is that it is part of the wall that was worked on by John Clayton's workforce, who replaced fallen stones and did consolidation work in the 19th century. And in the area around Cat Stairs, a lot of chamfered stones were found that might possibly indicate that there was a walkway on the wall. And then when you come down off Peel Crags and down the steep east slope here of Peel Gap, you come to an additional tower, Peel Gap Tower, which was discovered in 1987. And that's a photograph of it, halfway between Turret 39A and 39B up here. In this location, the narrow wall was actually built on wider broad wall foundations, and then this tower was added onto the wall and demolished when the wall was rebuilt later in probably about the early 3rd century using the characteristic hard white mortar. And this was excavated and in the 1980s, and the archaeologists discovered the foundations of the tower with a hearth, and the finds showed it being used in a similar way to nearby turrets. And the suggestion is that this is here because the gap between 39A and 39B is particularly long. It's, I think, over 200 meters longer than the usual spacing. And the tower is there to kind of plug a gap. And if you have a look back at this map for a moment, this is the two bits of work that I'm going to talk about in terms of collapsed wall. There's a bit of collapsed wall here, and there's the collapsed wall over there at Cat Stairs. And you can see this is what's known as the Peel Bothy Field. When that gate you saw was allowing access into the field to this side of the wall. And you've got consolidated visible wall up to here. You lose it coming down, and it picks up again on this side of the field gate. Okay, so just to show you a little bit more clearly exactly where the work was, these long purple stretches are where consolidation work was done on top of the wall to try and deter people from climbing on and walking on it. The repair work was done here this is Peel Gap. And we also did some work at the end here where the wall meets another dry stone wall running up to Steel Rig Car Park. And here you can see the Cat Stairs location. Okay, So here we've got pictures of the sort of things that these are photographs taken when we all went out to look at the problem and to think about what we were going to do about it early in autumn 2020. And you can see here is the cat stairs collapse, where the whole of the southern face of the wall has just bellied out and tumbled. The same at Peel Gap, which is actually an older collapse. You can see how some of the vegetation has grown in amongst the stones. And these are stretches. This is a stretch running up from Peel Gap up towards Steel Rig, and you can see people have been walking along the top of it. You can see a sort of path beaten in there. And this is one of the places at the gate into the Peel Bothy field where people have been climbing up onto the top to walk along. And also at the end of the wall where it butts onto the road up to Steel Rig, there was a really easy place to climb up, to stand on the end of the wall and take one of those wonderful photographs. Okay, so, oh, sorry, that's I've managed to stick one of my slides across the ones underneath. I'm sorry about that. That was supposed to fly in later. You'll have to imagine a little bit of what's going on underneath. I just thought it might be worth talking a little bit about how the process of repairing stretches of Hadrian's Wall, how it happens. And we were working here with a firm called Heritage Consolidation, who've got enormous experience in doing this kind of work. And the first thing that happens is that the collapse is dismantled and the stones are taken away and the turf and the vegetation are taken away from the area of the collapse. And all the time there is an archaeologist, in this case it was me, on hand to look out for anything that might come out of the rubble and the fill, and also to look out for undisturbed Roman courses and just generally to keep an eye on what's happening. So I'm there with Heritage Consolidation, and they first of all take it apart, and sometimes it's necessary to unpick a bit further on either side of the collapse in order to then be able to knit the courses back together again better. But as they're taking down, they're moving the rubble a bit further away from the site of the collapse and taking down the slumped courses from within the collapse. The team are stacking the stones, as you can see here, in terms of size and whether they're facing stones or rubble stones, so that they've got a kind of spread out in front of them, a sort of deconstructed wall. You know, there's deconstructed puddings. This is a deconstructed wall, all stacked on the ground, so they can see what they've got available. Now, I'm really sorry about this. I forgot to turn this bit into an animation, but underneath this is at Peel Gap, and you've got there, after the dismantling has happened and the team have got a secure course at the bottom, in this case both south-facing courses, which they can then build back up onto with the stones that they've taken out. Now, in the process of doing the rebuilding, they're of course packing core back in behind the facing, and in some cases they are tail bedding, so bedding the ends of the stones that are within the wall with mortar to hold the repair together better. And you can see on the right a little bit of the wall is working on Cat's Stairs, which was a very steep descent, so was quite hard in terms of keeping everything level and secure as they built it back up. And then when they get to the top, this is what this little diagram shows, the profiling of the top, the reprofiling of the top with loose core stones and clumps of turf introduced amongst them is intended to give this rounded shape to the top of the wall, and also to give it a natural appearance because of the growth of the turf, but to discourage people because it's not so easy as climbing on top of a flat turfed surface. So this stony domed surface is not as easy to walk on. Okay, so let's just look at those two locations of repair in a little bit more detail. So Here you can see a bit better the slide of the early stages of taking the rubble and courses out from the wall and clearing in order to be able to then reconstruct. And as we got down towards the bottom, it's about a nearly 4-meter gap. The first sign that we were getting to anything that was close to undisturbed was this course here. Now, this may originally have been a course of undisturbed Roman stone, so possibly even not ones that had been rearranged, rebuilt by John Clayton's workers, but it wasn't entirely in situ because the bellying out of the collapse and the weight of the stone on top of it had caused this to just dislodge and cant forwards. So it wasn't stable enough at this stage to be able to rebuild the stretch of the wall in this location. So that had to be taken carefully to one side. And what we had underneath was what looked like it might be a foundation course, possibly. The stones were much bigger than any of the facing stones up above. We couldn't tell if they projected out from the face of the courses above because all the other courses had slipped and tumbled. But this was undoubtedly secure and in situ and almost certainly undisturbed Roman work. And there was also there were also traces of mortar at this level. Some of which had silt on top from that had come down from the core up above, but some of it which looked in very good condition, and it was a sort of yellowish sand and lime mortar with inclusions of pink fired clay. And I took away a sample to be tested and looked at. And once I'd done my recording, the team were then able to rebuild using those carefully laid out stones on top of that. And this here is a picture of them having just finished doing the repair of the gap and doing the reprofiling with turf amidst the core stones on the top. And one of the things that also needed to be done in that stretch of wall on the west slope of Peel Gap was repairing the area around this field gate. And this was one of the areas where people had climbed up. And so that was reprofiling work to discourage the climbing and also repair of the field wall to the left to stop people from climbing up and over that and to give the whole thing a much better, much sort of better cared for look to try and discourage people from climbing over and on top of. So the other repair work was the work here at Cat Stairs, and there you can see the team are beginning. They've got a string level there. They're beginning to rebuild this stretch of the wall. Now here, when the collapse was dismantled, the stones were taken over to one side, it was apparent that this was the collapse of a previously repaired stretch because there was a plastic membrane, you can perhaps just about see it here, within the core that lapped down to the secure course of stones that the team stopped at to then rebuild. And in this case, it was unclear whether that was a course of stones that had been consolidated in by John Clayton's workforce or not. And in both cases, in both of those repairs, there were no other finds aside from the mortar made, or in a 2012 one-penny piece at Cat Stairs and a toad at Peel Gap. And here you can see a good picture to show you what the reconsolidated top looks like just as it's being done. And this is the solution that the Heritage Consolidation team came to for deterring people from climbing out of their cars on the roads just the other side of this wall and up onto this end of the wall. And so they've just elegantly heightened the dry stone wall so that when you're actually driving along, it's very difficult to see that there is a nice platform to climb onto there. So that was the repair and consolidation work that we were able to do on that stretch of the wall. And I'm now going to go on and talk about the excavation at Walltown Crags, which was itself followed by some consolidation work. So the excavation site that you saw earlier in the slide is located here, and it's east of Greenhead Quarry here, which took a chunk out of the wall, with Castle 45 just to the east, and Mucklebank Turret up on the Mucklebank Turret 44B up on the crag beyond Wartown Nick, so that's here. And it's a very rugged stretch, as you saw on that first slide, and the wall runs rather sinuously, sticking to the crest of the crag, and they really do seem to be trying the best possible to keep to the very crest of the crags. And I think Ian will have some really good views in his talk later on today of the geology of this area, which is it's really important to understand as you're thinking about why there is this particular attention to sticking to the crest of the crag. And I think it's worth having in your mind that at that crest, because of the way in which the geology tips, its geology is particularly close to the surface there, and we'll come back to that. So we also have got the earthworks of Castle 45 very close to the excavation site, turret 45A, which here, and then turret 45B was taken out by this other large quarry site here. Okay, I just think this Google Earth image shows very nicely the sort of context for the excavation site. Here you can see the earthworks of the Castle, and this is where we were excavating. Now, there is a nice stretch of the wall here with quite a lot of the south face exposed, not along the whole stretch, but some of it. And it's also, as you'll see, where there was an early 20th century fairly minor excavation, and that's showing up as a sort of darker line behind the south face of the wall here. And you can see the dramatic bite taken out of the line of the wall by the quarrying. So there you go, there's the Castle, and there's the stretch of wall that we're focusing on. So here we are down on the ground where my second red circle was, and we're looking northeast, and this is the stretch of the wall that you could see sort of standing out on the Google Earth image, what it looks like. You see that in some places the south face of the wall is exposed to all three courses. In some places the grass has lapped up to it. And then on the top you've got a lot of loose core, big core stones looking very vulnerable and exposed. Now, the important thing about this slide as well is it shows very clearly this earlier excavation. Here's the bank, which is the long spoil heap of their work, and this is the ditch that they dug running along the face of the south wall for 30 odd meters. And there we've got the end of the Edwardian excavation, and then you can see that the wall disappears under turf and vegetation as you work just towards where the earthworks of the Castle are. Now, why are we here? The reason we were there was that something needed to be done about that exposed wall core. It's very loose and slipping, but it was also an opportunity to understand more of the construction and history of the narrow wall in a location where there had been no earlier interventions by antiquarians, or no John Clayton work. So there had been, as far as we knew, no previous repairs, and that a lot of it had been under the ground for really quite some time. We also wanted to try and understand more about that early 20th century excavation, for which there are very minimal records. And so those two objectives were driving what we were doing, and it was to be done ahead of consolidation work to secure that exposed core material. So I've just borrowed from Catherine some of the photogrammetry, the 3D photographs of those trenches, just to give you a quick look at them in their sort of wall context. And here you can see, I'm coming back to talk about them a lot more, but here you can see trench 1. This is the end here of the ditch of the early 20th century excavation. This is the end of the spoil bank of that excavation, and you can see that our trench runs, just catches a bit of the spoil bank, and then runs up to the south face. It goes across the wall and down to the north face. And trench 2 is to the west of that, and it's across the earlier excavation. You can see it's across the bank into the ditch and up to the south face of the wall again. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit more about that first one, trench 1. Both of these trenches are about 2 meters running up to the wall, by the way. So we were there for 8 days, and up until the day before, it was planned there were going to be volunteers with us. And we were glad that actually quite a few people did manage to come out and visit in a properly socially distanced way. But sadly, the work was done by me and Catherine with welcome help from Rob. Here in trench 1, what we discovered in an area where this now exposed south face had been buried, and north face, as you'll see later, had been buried for some time, is that we've got a footings course, 5 complete courses, 1 partial, and 2 stones of a 7th course. And it's all a roughly squared Carboniferous sandstone, except probably this one here, this pinkish stone, which is probably igneous. It's a lovely orangey pink, glowed in certain lights, and is likely from further afield. But I'm sure Ian will talk more about that later on in one of our other talks. And what we found from this trench was that there had been phases of collapse of the wall of this south to the south of the wall. Now, remember that this trench is actually just on one of those bends that the wall takes quite often in this part of the wall, and that I think that as a consequence, it was likely to be a little bit more unstable if it was if there was any kind of dismantling or any kind of work done near to it. But we found that there was one or possibly a series of major collapses, which you can see in these stones here. This is in the section through it. It's these big stones and core material and rubble, and with one sort of section of 3 facing stones that had literally slid away from the wall on top of the collapse underneath it, and that a turf had formed on top of that. There's a turf line here. And that the spoil from the Edwardian excavation was put on top of that turf, so that we've got pre-early 20th century collapse, and that material, the sort of soil around the stones had become really quite homogenized over time. And then there was another major collapse, possibly again a series, but probably at least one, the first one probably being a major collapse on top of the Edwardian spoil bank. And it's very likely that that work in the early 20th century actually provoked that collapse on the bend of the wall. Now, the other really interesting thing about this trench was that when we got right down to the bottom here, we found that that bottom course of the wall was built directly onto bedrock, and in this place really flat, unweathered bedrock that had clearly been under the ground and not been exposed for any great period of time. But this course here of slightly bigger stones is built directly onto bedrock, and this course is also slightly projecting, as you can see, up to about 15 centimetres. The other thing that we found we could see from this stretch of the wall is that there had been no visible repairs in this particular little stretch, and there was no evidence at all for bonding. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't, because there's quite a lot of free-flowing water trickling down through all the collapse here, and it may be that it has simply been eroded by various processes over time. Now, the narrow wall, Catherine and I made an attempt to, in incredibly windy conditions, to measure the width of the wall here, and it's about 2.18 meters wide, which accords pretty well with the usual width of the narrow wall, perhaps a little on the narrower side. The stones, the size of the stones is pretty much again in line with stones in the narrow wall, although you can see there's one course which is slightly narrower than the others. So that's the south face. There you can see, this is the Edwardian spoil bank, by the way. You can see the remains of the turf layer. This is sort of blackish, rather damp. It was very wet at points in the excavation. And they're the stones of the spoil bank thrown on top of that. Now, this is the north face, which we had to be a little bit more careful about, because obviously it was right on the edge of the cliff. You can see that Catherine looks like she's hanging over the cliff here. In fact, at one point, there were some helicopters that flew below the level of Catherine while she was working there. And so we didn't want to destabilize the wall at all. And so we took the turf off and had a look at it, and uncovered one course here of the north face. And what was clear, that and these facing courses, by the way, were at a considerably lower level than some of the courses on the south face. So clearly more of the facing had collapsed off the wall here. There'd been a differential sort of collapse on either side of the wall. On the north, it looks like it may have been more slumping and more sort of repeated smaller collapses than the bigger collapses that happened on the south. Okay, so that was trench 1. Now, trench 2 to the west, which was looking at the early 20th century excavation, and at the base of the wall, south face of the wall there, that's really interesting, because here you can see, again, it's built directly onto bedrock. This is bedrock, this is bedrock, this is bedrock, this is bedrock. But unlike that in trench 1, where it was flat and crisp and smooth, this is clearly bedrock that has been exposed for some time, and was very probably exposed when the builders of the wall came along. The footings are really very different to cope with the unevenness of the weathered bedrock. You can see that this course looks fairly unremarkable, but look at these little chock stones here that have been put between that course and the bedrock in order to level things, and all along here, and how you get 2 courses here and 1 here, and then you lose both of those as you go further east, so that they are changing the way in which they build the foundations of the wall in order to fit in with the bedrock. So we don't know whether the Roman builders here just cleared a line where they were going to build the wall, looking for the bedrock, but they were clearly targeting it, or whether they just cleared a whole area and built the wall as best possible onto the exposed bedrock, some of which is already exposed and some of which they had cleared. But it may be that part of that sinuous course of the wall is to do with looking for the bedrock to build the wall onto. Now, I wanted to talk just a little bit about turret 45A, just to the west, because it's interesting to compare what's going on there with that building onto bedrock in our excavations. Because this was partly excavated for the second pilgrimage in 1886, but was re-examined in 1959 before it was consolidated. And here you can see that the north wall of the turret is built directly onto bedrock, and that's really interesting. And you can see that here that the wall is butting onto it, but when you look at the plan, you can see here they note that it's built onto natural rock. And if you look at the sort of section through it, you can see that this is here is natural bedrock, and that as they've built the turret, they have used the same system. Can you see them, of the little chock stones, to level up the courses above, so that the walls are built directly onto bedrock. Yeah, so there we are, natural bedrock. So after we had done our work there, the team from Heritage Consolidation came in to do their repair, and one of the things they did was to rebed some of the slipped stones at the top of those courses of the southern face exposed in Trench 1, make sure those weren't going to slip out and collapse further. And then they've done the same turf and stone work along the top to consolidate all those big loose stones on the top of the wall. And the other thing that they did was that at that turret, Mucklebank turret, that was also causing some concern with collapse and exposed core, and they did some strengthening of the corner with some tail-bedded mortaring and reprofiling of the top in order to secure and reduce the risk of collapse at Mucklebank turret. Okay, so it's clear from the excavations, I think, that those building the wall were looking for the bedrock. They knew that on that crest of the crags, the bedrock was close to the surface, and they were going to try and build as far as possible onto that. And they used various techniques in order to create level courses by using chock stones and increasing the number of courses of sort of foundation courses in order to ensure that there was a level course. There wasn't any unambiguous use of mortar or any other bonding agents, but that may just be because we have lost it due to erosion. And there wasn't any evidence for repair or rebuilding of the curtain, but that may be because they were just tiny trenches. But it helps us to understand more about the different techniques that were used to build different stretches of the wall, and also the history of collapse of the wall in different places and caused by different things. It seems from our little intervention there that the wall in that location didn't necessarily suffer too many collapses during its time of use, but that the collapses were associated with probably with episodes of robbing and dismantling and the earlier excavation. So here we are at this point, just our tiny little team working on those excavations, and I hope very much that we will this year be able to have proper volunteer rich teams out there doing things, but it's so important to me that we do our best to try and make that happen as you know, as soon as we're allowed to, because it's just such a wonderful thing working together on this extraordinary site, and I look forward very much to doing that in the future. And I'd like to thank you all for listening, and if you have got any questions, I'll try and answer them, but thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much.